Gospels. Look at the family of Jesus in Matthew and Mark, and we find a very common family there. The mother's called Mary, ranked number 1 for women. The father's called Joseph, ranked number 2. We've got children, Jesus, James, Joseph, and Simon and Judas, with rank 6, 4, 2, 1, and 6, 11, 2, 1, and 4. And if you're going to choose one to be the Saviour of the world, the best name with the best meaning would be Jesus, because it's got a bit of salvation in. The other names don't have that. But maybe that was just coincidence, okay? We'll allow that for the time being. We use irony over in Britain sometimes, but there we are. Okay, there are lots of ironic things about British history as well, but we won't go into that. When we look at Paul, for Paul, the name Christ predominates over the name Jesus. I've given you in green for each of the letters. I've given you the name Jesus, in blue the name Christ. And of course sometimes you get Christ Jesus and Jesus Christ. But the point is, for Paul the name Christ is more common. For the non-Christian writers the name Christ is more common. And so I would conclude that very quickly, though Jesus was the earliest name, very quickly the name Christ came to predominate. So if the Gospels were written a lot later, they might well have forgotten the name Jesus. But they correctly get the name Jesus. Groups very far removed from the origins of Christianity might forget the name Jesus altogether, like the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary. Let's then look at the question of what the principal character is called by other characters. Now, we've already seen how many words there are in the Gospel. This is Luke is the longest Gospel and Mark's the shortest. Compare that with the occurrences of Jesus in the 4 Gospels, and you find that John has the most occurrences of Jesus, Mark has the fewest. But hey, Mark's the shortest Gospel. So let's look at that. Names of Jesus as a proportion of length, and you find that Luke has the fewest occurrences of the name Jesus, and John has the most. But that's simply because Luke tends to say he a lot rather than Jesus. Now, all I'm trying to show at that point, this is going to be important for later on, is that the 4 Gospels use the name Jesus differently. Why do I want to show that? I want to show that so that we can know that it's not been some conspiracy to make the way Jesus is mentioned in all 4 Gospels look the same way. Because they've got a very different pattern of naming Jesus. But what we're going to see is they also name Jesus in the same way. Look at this. Jesus was a common name, rank number 6 at the time. Jesus simply the name Joshua. There are other Jesuses in the New Testament. Jesus called Justus, Bar Jesus. Some manuscripts for Matthew's Gospel give Barabbas his name as Jesus Barabbas. So it's a common name. And what we find is in the narrative, it simply, generally, calls Jesus Jesus. So here we got Matthew 21. They did just as Jesus had told them. But of course, Jesus in speech would be ambiguous. So we find in speech, the crowds don't just say, hey, Jesus is coming down the road. They say, this is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee. They disambiguate. But then, next verse, narrator says, and Jesus went into the temple. Now, the narrator doesn't need to say anything more than Jesus, because if you've got up to chapter 20 of a gospel and you don't know who you're reading about, there's a bit of a problem. Yeah? So it's obvious, you know, which Jesus we're talking about. But for the crowds back then, there were lots of Jesuses. And so we find the way the crowds speak is an authentic way that people would have had to have spoken. Look at another example. Matthew 26. Narrator says, Jesus said to him, but next thing, along comes a servant girl to Peter, who's about to deny Jesus, and said, you were with Jesus, the Galilean. You know, not every Jesus came from Galilee, so she could distinguish this person. She says, well, I know he came from another place, Jesus the Galilean. A slightly more clued up servant girl comes along and says, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. But then, the narrator simply continues, Peter remembered the saying of Jesus. So the way the characters speak is one way, the way the narrator speaks is another way. We go on. Pilate says to the crowds, who do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus who is called Christ? What shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ? In other words, not every Jesus has the name Christ or Messiah after him. This one is distinguished. On the cross, Jesus, the King of the Jews. And even an angel needs to disambiguate. You're looking for Jesus who was crucified. Now there, we've gone through Matthew's Gospel. More quickly, we can go through the other Gospels. The same thing applies to Mark. What do we have to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Hearing that Jesus of Nazareth, he began to call out, Son of David, Jesus. Now in this case it's interesting that the narrator says Jesus of Nazareth, but of course he's saying that in reporting what someone heard. In other words, implied speech there. The point is, it's not that he heard that Jesus was coming down the road, he heard that Jesus of Nazareth was coming down the road, and so he got excited and he called out, Son of David, Jesus, because not every Jesus had their genealogy traced back to David. Or as someone said, you were with the Nazarene Jesus, or the angel, you seek Jesus of Nazareth. Going through Luke's Gospel, what do we have to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Jesus, Son of the Most High God. Jesus, teacher. Not every Jesus is a rabbi. They told Jesus of Nazarene was passing by. He called out, Jesus, Son of David. Now, you might think it's an exception when the dying thief in Luke chapter 23 turns to Jesus and says, Jesus, remember me. But there we are not talking about a crowd situation where you try and pick someone out from a crowd. You're talking one-to-one. So that disambiguation simply doesn't apply. And anyway, people on crosses don't waste words. And then we have Jesus on the road to Emmaus meets two disciples. And he acts as if he doesn't know what's been going on. And they say, well, don't you know the things that have gone on concerning Jesus of Nazareth? So that's Luke's Gospel. We find the same pattern in John. We found the one that Moses and the law and the prophets wrote about. Jesus, the son of Joseph from Nazareth. Isn't this Jesus, son of Joseph, whom we know? You might think it's an exception in John chapter 9, where the man who's born blind and is healed is asked who healed him, and he said, well, the man called Jesus made clay. Why does he just simply say the man called Jesus? The point that's going on here in the narrative is precisely, if you read it carefully, this man has been given physical sight, but he's not yet been given full spiritual sight. Gradually through the narrative, he comes to realize more and more. And so what the narrative is doing is, in order to show that he's still, to some degree, ignorant, he only knows that the guy's called Jesus, he doesn't know anything more. He's an Australian called Bruce. I mean, that doesn't really tell you very much. Yeah? And so here, to show the ignorance, there's no more detail. And then, in the garden, whom are you seeking? They replied, we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. That happens twice on the cross. Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. So this is a pattern across all four Gospels. When it occurs in speech, Jesus, in a crowd situation, Jesus is disambiguated, and that would have been necessary at the time and completely unnecessary 100 years later or in a completely different setting. So here we've got the sort of thing that fits with the time and place. Now, of course, you can say, well, they were just really clever narrators, narrative art, all four of them really clever. It starts becoming a little bit implausible for me to appeal to that. And the more clever you make the narrators, the harder it is to say they got it wrong through incompetence. Okay, what does the principal character call himself? One of the things about the principal character is that the way he speaks is different from the early church. For instance, he does not spend time teaching about what to do with the Gentiles. A lot of the early church were Gentiles, but there's just no direct teaching on that. He does not teach on how to run a church service. Just as well, isn't it? But what he does is he calls, he teaches in parables. But how many parables did Paul tell? What about the early church? Well, there's one called the Shepherd of Hermas. There's a bit of a parable. But on the whole, the early church just didn't take to parables. So the idea that the early church made up the parables later just doesn't really make sense when they're not using parables later on. So it's not just that his teaching's different, it's also the way he talks about himself that's different. Because his favourite self-designation is to call himself the Son of Man. And you know what about the title, the Son of Man, is it's very rarely used not on Jesus' lips. So it's not a title that became really common in the early church. It's actually different. So we've got threefold this. The narrator speaks a plausible way, the characters in a narrative speaks a plausible way, and the main character speaks in a different way from the way people spoke later. To me, that comes together to say, yes, what we've got is a reliable account. Looking at the distribution of the way the phrase the Son of Man is used, we find it's very common in Matthew, Mark and Luke, the four left-hand columns. When we look at the apocryphal Gospels on the right, it can be pretty uncommon. So my conclusion is not that I can prove the Gospels are true on this basis. My conclusion is rather that the names have the sort of pattern in the Gospels that would happen if they were reporting what people actually said and did. And it would be very hard for any person trying to make the story look plausible to put that pattern in. It just simply is too complex. The complexity you would need for an ancient forger would be quite incredible. Now, more briefly, I want us to look at some more tests. The next test is going to be the test of geography. Do they simply know the place? Well, you know, one of the things you find out is how ropey people's knowledge of geography can be away from the place where they live. So my knowledge of the geography of Texas really is pretty bad. I've got to say there are all sorts of places that are probably huge that I've never heard of. And so one of the things that we would expect to be the case is if people were writing stories a long way away, they're not going to know the names of places. Well, look at the names of places we get in the four Gospels. The most common town name is Jerusalem, the capital city. The second most common is Nazareth, the town associated with Jesus. But it's not just that you have those two known. You also have some quite obscure villages known. Places like Bethphage, a little village near Jerusalem. You get Chorazin known up in Galilee. Well, the question is this. How would someone in Syria, in Turkey, in Greece, in Italy, in Egypt, know about the names of those villages? I mean, I just can't think how they would know. In Rome, probably the best place to go to a bookshop. Well, if you went and bought a book about geography, it would tell you about the great places on earth to go and see before you die, which didn't include Bethphage, which didn't include Chorazin, you see? So what you find is, how would people well away from the place know these things? And it's not just that they know the names of places. They know things about them. They know that Capernaum is next to the sea. They know the way where the land goes up and down. They know travelling times, all those sorts of things. How do they get that right? We compare that with what's mentioned in apocryphal Gospels. The four canonical Gospels, 12 to 14 towns each, total of 23. Gospel of Philip, 2 towns, Jerusalem and Nazareth. But it thinks that Nazareth is Jesus' middle name. So that's not very good. So it's only really got one place correctly mentioned, that's Jerusalem, which is the capital. What about Gospels of Peter and of the Saviour? They've got one town and it's called Jerusalem, the capital. And what about 13 other earliest apocryphal Gospels? How many town names have they got? 0. So all of the correctly placed town names in the 16 earliest apocryphal Gospels and fragments, 1. Jerusalem, the capital of the whole area. That to me is not very impressive geographical knowledge. But it also means that rather than being evidence against the four Gospels, the apocryphal Gospels are in fact evidence for the four Gospels, because they show what would happen if people did make up stories. They are the controlled experiment, if you like, that show what could go on another way. Now I want us to look at the number of words there are in the four Gospels. That's the 4 left-hand columns, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and I've given you 5 non-biblical Gospels on the right-hand columns. Okay, I want you to fix your eyes on those 4 left-hand columns very carefully and look at their shape. I've just changed slide to the number of place names. This is not just town names, this is places like Golgotha, river names and so on. Did you notice the change of shape? This is the number of words per gospel. This is the number of place names per gospel. You notice a sort of big drop-off effect here. They're just not very good on place names. But there's another thing. What if we do place names as a proportion of length? What happens? Ooh. we find that all 4 Gospels have an amazing evenness of place name mentions. I began looking at this in an English version, had someone do a bit of research for me, and I said to her, you know, I have a suspicion that place names occur more in the 4 canonical Gospels than in the other ones. Could you go and look at it? So she worked on an English translation, English Standard Version. She found that the 4 canonical Gospels, between 4.6 and 4.9 place names per 1,000 words. That was what you wanted to know tonight, wasn't it? Now, the great thing about this is you can actually do this experiment at home. Just get the electronic text of the 4 Gospels, you know, get all the capitalized words at the front, strip out all the ones that aren't place names, and just work it out. It's not hard. This is the sort of thing you can replicate. And what's the amazing thing is that the 4 Gospels have the same evenness. How are we to explain it? I've got a great explanation. Okay? This is it. Luke talks to Mark. Mark, how many words do you have in your Gospel? Mark goes through really carefully counting the number of words he has in his Gospel. Now, by the way, the words were not separated in Greek manuscripts, so that made it a bit harder for Mark to count. But he went through very dutifully, and he counted, and he worked out the number of place names. And then Luke said, hey, I want you to find out the number of words, I want the number of place names, and I want a proportion. And when Luke had worked this out, he actually created a narrative with the same proportion of place names in. Matthew and John heard about this. They thought it was a great idea that they would replicate this same feature. You know, just before computing, this sort of thing, people didn't have much to do before TV, and so that's what they did. Well, is that really plausible? Would they get that sort of pattern if they simply put in place names to make the narrative look authentic? One would put in too many, one would put in too few. It just wouldn't work out. But what if they simply told things as they happened? They're all the same sort of narrative. They're telling you gospel, naturally putting in place names as they're relevant. Is it plausible that if their narratives are long enough, they would have roughly the same proportion? That, to me, seems a more plausible explanation. It's not that they have the same proportion in every passage. Matthew 5 to 7, Sermon on the Mount, no place names. But over the narrative as a whole, we find the same concern for geography, not in a way that sort of is intrusive, that's trying to give you extra details you don't know. It's just trying to give you some relevant details. It's about real time and space. That, to me, explains what's going on. I've got another test. It's the test of botany. Now, does anyone know the story of Zacchaeus, yeah? The little man, yeah? Do you know what sort of tree he climbed up? Sycamore tree. Can anyone sing that for us? You know? Yeah? Anyone? Can we do this together? Zacchaeus? No. Okay, we won't. Right, okay, more difficult question. This is the next level. What town was he in when he climbed the sycamore tree? Jericho. Oh, we got an answer from a few places. This is great. You're a good audience tonight. Fantastic. He was in Jericho, and that's in Luke's Gospel. So the question is, what's the question? What's the question we're going to ask? Are there sycamore trees in Jericho? The answer is, you bet. You see, look here. There are some guys in this sycamore tree in Jericho. You see that? They are standing in Jericho. Now, how could Luke know that? I have three possibilities, but let's start with the first two. One possibility is he went to Jericho and he saw there are sycamores. The other is he spoke to someone who went to Jericho who saw there were sycamores. The third possibility is aliens from outer space told him. But I'm going to discount that third explanation. There may be others, but let's just focus on those first two. Those first two seem to me the most worthy of consideration. What we've got is, this is the sort of thing that people who've been to the place know. Now, if the Gospels are getting this right, they're not just getting it right on place names and names and plants, they're getting the shape of house right, they're getting the shape of the temple right, they're getting the coinage right, they're getting the social stratification right, they're getting the religious setting right. After a while you think, there are so many opportunities for them to go wrong if they are making it up. So many opportunities, and they don't seem to go wrong like that. The other thing we can say is that sort of sycamore tree, Ficus sycamoris, where did it occur? Well, I went to the most authoritative source of all, Wikipedia, this is the modern distribution, but I checked it's also the same as the ancient distribution. There are no Ficus sycamoris in Turkey, Greece, Italy. You know, it's there, Syria, Palestine, Egypt. You know, in certain countries, the narrator couldn't even have heard of those things unless he'd actually talked to someone who'd been in the land. So this is the sort of thing that fits very well if the narrative is true. I want to bring some passages, some tests together for a look at one narrative. There are very few things that occur in all four Gospels. The Passion narrative, of course, the triumphal entry, but the miracle that occurs in all four Gospels is the feeding of the 5,000. Now, I can't prove that a miracle occurred. Okay, no one can prove that a miracle occurred, but we can ask this. The narrative about the feeding of the 5,000, does that come from close to the alleged event or from far away? That's the basic question we're going to look at and see what's the case. Let's start with the numbers. Well, how do you count 5,000 people? Well, you know, have you ever been to one of those church or Christian events where they sort of wildly overestimated the number of people in attendance? That can sometimes happen. So the question is, could that 5,000 just be some disciple guesstimate? Well, there are a huge number there, and so on. Well, what you find is that both Mark and Luke tell us about the counting of the people. Mark tells us that Jesus commanded them to sit down in groups on the grass, and the groups were by hundreds and fifties. Luke says there are 5,000. He'd said to the disciples, have them sit in groups of 50 each. Now, if you've got 12 disciples, and 5,000 men, that's less than 100 groups. That's about 8 groups each. Do you think the disciples could count up to 8? A tax collector, fisherman, it's the sort of thing they probably could, 1, 2, 3, many is the way some students work. But no, I think they could have done that. That would have been a task that they would have been up to. But then we look at the narrative in a bit more detail. What we find is that Mark and John both comment on the grass. Mark tells you there was green grass. John tells you there was much grass. Now, the question is that just a detail that's made up to make the story look authentic, or is it real eyewitness detail? But Mark tells you there were many coming and going, but he doesn't explain why many were coming and going. But then John tells you it was Passover time. Now, if I put those two things together, one explains the other, because at Passover time, people, of course, travel to Passover. Okay? So what happens is the one explains the other. Lots of people will be traveling at that time, and so Jesus calls his disciples aside. But then in John's Gospel, Jesus turns to Philip, and he says to Philip, where should we buy bread from? Why does he turn to Philip of all of the disciples he could have chosen? The Gospel doesn't say. But then in John's Gospel, we find that Philip replies, and then Andrew replies. Why? The Gospel doesn't say. But Luke's Gospel tells us that the feeding took place near Bethsaida, and John's Gospel tells us that Philip and Andrew were from Bethsaida. Now think about that. If I read through John's Gospel on its own, I see no significance whatsoever to that. They are just simply isolated bits of information. They don't fit together. If I plug in that information from Luke, suddenly the thing makes sense. Jesus turns to a man with local knowledge and asks him where to buy bread from. That man and another man get involved in the reply. That makes complete sense. Even the little detail in John that they were barley loaves fits exactly with the time of year when you've had Passover, because you've just had the barley harvest. But we want to ask the question, would the grass really have been green? Well, let's go to a precipitation chart from a nearby town. And we find from Tiberias, we can say, when would the Passover have been? Would have been roughly around then for any of those years. We've just had 6 of the greatest months of precipitation. Would the grass have been green? You bet. So in other words, all of these things come together. And they build, for me, a narrative which looks believable. It looks credible. This is not something that's been made up well away from the place, just as stories were related. Now, some people want to have this idea that the way miracles about Jesus were attributed to him was a gradual process whereby people just exaggerated, and through exaggeration, through many different steps, they gradually got to this idea of a guy who'd performed many, many miracles. One of the things that's so striking about miracles of Jesus is that so many miracles are attributed